It didn't begin with panic, riots, or crashing banks. It began with confidence, blinding, overwhelming, unstoppable confidence. In the fall of 1929, America was flying high on optimism, innovation, and the belief that prosperity was permanent. Millions of people truly believed that the United States had entered a new era where the economy would grow forever, businesses would never fail, and the stock market would only go up. But beneath that glittering surface was a fragile economic structure built on speculation, easy credit, and unrealistic expectations. And while the nation celebrated its apparent success, the disaster had already begun quietly, invisibly, months before anyone understood what was coming. This is the story of how America collapsed in 1929, step by step, through a chain of events that revealed the truth hidden beneath the decade's excitement and prosperity. Before we continue, take one moment to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. To truly understand the Great Depression, you first have to understand the decade that preceded it. The 1920s were unlike anything America had experienced before. It was a decade defined by the explosion of consumer culture, the rise of new technologies, and a public belief that the country had unlocked the secret to unlimited economic growth. Factories were producing more goods than ever, cities were expanding, wages were rising, and large corporations seemed invincible. Products that had once been luxuries, automobiles, radios, refrigerators, telephones, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, became common household items. Advertising convinced people they needed more of everything, and department stores welcomed the flood of eager customers. America was celebrating itself, and the entire world noticed. Newspapers praised the nation's economy. Investors called the stock market a miracle, and even respected economists declared that the country had entered a permanently prosperous era. But prosperity often hides danger, and in this case, the danger was enormous. Much of the 1920s economy was not supported by real, sustainable wealth, but by credit, an ever-expanding pile of borrowed money. Credit changed the way Americans lived. Instead of saving to buy something, people simply paid later, spreading out their debt over months or years. Cars, clothes, radios, furniture, appliances, even everyday necessities, were purchased on installment plans. This new culture of borrowing fueled demand, which made factories expand and hire more workers, which pushed the economy even higher. But it also created a situation where millions of households were stretched beyond their financial limits. They were buying more than they could afford, and they were relying on future income to pay for present luxuries. This made the economy extremely vulnerable to any slowdown. The second, and even more dangerous crack in the system was the stock market. During the 1920s, the stock market became a national obsession. It seemed like an endless fountain of wealth. People who had never invested before, teachers, farmers, factory workers, office clerks, suddenly believed they could become rich by buying the right stocks. Newspapers printed stories of overnight millionaires. Financial commentators said the market would only rise. The banks made investing even easier by allowing people to buy stocks on margin, meaning they only needed to pay a small percentage, sometimes as low as 10%, while the bank loaned them the rest. As long as prices climbed, everyone made money. But this also created a massive financial bubble because investors were gambling with borrowed funds. If prices fell, the bubble would burst, and the losses would be devastating. Yet even with these risks, the excitement continued. Throughout 1928 and into early 1929, stock prices doubled and then doubled again. Companies that had no real profits saw their stock prices soar because speculation had taken over. People weren't investing in businesses. They were betting on the idea that stock prices would keep rising simply because they always had. Wall Street became a giant casino where millions played the same dangerous game without understanding the rules. Meanwhile, real economic problems were growing underneath the illusion. Factories were producing more goods than people could buy. Warehouses slowly filled with unsold products. Farmers, who had borrowed heavily during World War I to expand their land and purchase machinery, found themselves crushed by falling crop prices. Rural communities struggled long before the crash, but the booming cities overshadowed their suffering. The government, believing the economy was strong, failed to act. Despite rising economic pressure, The stock market continued to climb because the public refused to believe anything was wrong. Then, slowly, quietly, things began to change in mid-1929. Industrial production fell. Construction dropped. Car sales weakened. Steel output declined. Consumer spending slowed because people were drowning in debt. Retailers reported disappointing sales. Corporate profits softened. But Wall Street ignored every warning sign. Investors convinced themselves that the slowdown was temporary. They believed America was too strong to fail. The disaster finally began in October. In early October, some major investors started selling their shares. Prices dipped. More investors grew nervous. Newspapers published cautious headlines. Rumors spread across Wall Street that the market was unstable. And then, on October 24th, Black Thursday, panic hit. Investors rushed to sell their shares as prices fell sharply. Traders shouted over one another on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Phones rang nonstop as people tried to dump their stocks before prices fell further. Crowds gathered outside the building, sensing something was very wrong. The chaos grew so intense that leading bankers met in secret and pledged millions to buy stocks and stabilize the market. Their intervention temporarily slowed the collapse, giving Americans a brief moment of hope. But that hope lasted only a few days. On October 28th, Black Monday, panic returned. Prices fell again. Fear swept through the nation. And then came the worst day of all, October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, the day that would mark the beginning of the Great Depression. 16 million shares were traded in a single day, an unimaginable amount at the time. Stock prices collapsed. Billions of dollars disappeared. Investors fainted. Telephone lines jammed. People screamed as they watched their fortunes vanish. It was the greatest financial panic in American history. But here is the truth most people don't know. The crash did not cause the Great Depression. It revealed it. The economic system had been weakening for years. The crash simply exposed how fragile everything really was. Banks were the first institutions to crack. Because banks had invested heavily in the stock market and had loaned vast sums to investors, the collapse left them with enormous losses. When people learned that banks were in trouble, panic spread rapidly. Americans rushed to withdraw their savings. Long lines formed outside banks. People pleaded for their money. But most banks did not have enough cash to give everyone their deposits because their funds were tied up in bad loans and failed investments. As withdrawal after withdrawal drained the system, banks collapsed one after another. More than 600 banks failed in the early months, and thousands more were doomed to follow. With no deposit insurance, ordinary families lost everything overnight. When banks failed, credit vanished. Businesses could not borrow money to operate. Companies closed their doors. Factories halted production. Workers were laid off in massive numbers. By early 1930, unemployment soared as millions of Americans found themselves without jobs, without savings, and without any way to support their families. Breadlines stretched across city blocks. Soup kitchens appeared on every corner. Children went hungry. Families sold their belongings to survive. The American dream suddenly turned into a nightmare of fear and uncertainty. And yet, the darkest years of the Great Depression were still ahead. As 1930 began, the United States entered a period of economic decline deeper and more destructive than anything the country had ever experienced. What made it so devastating was that most Americans still believed the crisis would pass quickly. Newspapers reassured readers that the downturn was temporary. Business leaders insisted recovery was imminent. Politicians urged patience. But the reality unfolding across the nation was far more severe than anyone wanted to admit. The financial institutions that had powered the prosperity of the 1920s were collapsing from within, and the systems meant to protect the public did not exist yet. The consequences spread like a chain reaction, touching every city, every farm, every bank, every business, and every household. America was falling into a vortex that would reshape every part of its society. The first major blow came from the banking system. After the crash, banks were drowning in unpaid loans. Many had invested depositor money directly into the stock market, and when the market collapsed, those funds vanished. Panicked customers lined up outside local banks demanding to withdraw their savings. Because banks only kept a small fraction of deposits in cash, they were unable to satisfy the sudden rush of withdrawals. When one bank in a town failed, fear spread instantly to neighboring towns. People no longer trusted the institutions that held their life savings. Bank runs became common. Entire communities watched as their local banks shut their doors with signs that read, "Closed until further notice." Though many would never reopen. When banks failed, families lost everything, not just money, but security, hope, and the ability to survive the months ahead. As banks fell, businesses were starved of the credit they needed to operate. Loans dried up. Companies could not purchase materials, pay workers, or continue production. Small businesses disappeared first, local shops, manufacturers, and service providers. But soon even major corporations felt the impact. Without access to working capital, factories reduced output or closed entirely. Streets that once echoed with the sound of machinery grew silent. Industrial towns, once symbols of America's growth, became shadows of themselves. Workers lost their jobs in waves, and those who kept their employment often faced wage cuts and reduced hours. The sense of security that had defined the 1920s evaporated. Unemployment rose at an alarming rate. By the end of 1930, nearly 4 million Americans were unemployed. By 1931, that number climbed to 8 million. Across the country, men in worn-out clothes lined up at employment offices, hoping for work that almost never came. Many walked miles every day, knocking on doors of factories and shops that had nothing left to offer. Families who once owned homes and farms suddenly found themselves unable to pay mortgages or property taxes. Repossession became a common tragedy. Houses were taken by banks, and families were forced to leave with only what they could carry. Rentals quickly filled with desperate tenants who often couldn't afford the monthly payment either. Across the nation, makeshift settlements began to appear, collections of shacks built from wood scraps, cardboard, metal sheets, and anything people could salvage. These shantytowns grew on the outskirts of major cities and were given a bleak nickname, Hoovervilles, a bitter reference to President Herbert Hoover. Families burned trash to stay warm. Hunger became a daily reality. Charities and religious groups opened soup kitchens to feed the growing number of people with no means to buy food. Lines stretched for blocks. Many who stood in them had never imagined they would need charity to survive. The psychological toll was immense. Pride was broken. Hope was fading. Farmers suffered even earlier and even more deeply. While Wall Street celebrated the 1920s boom, agriculture had already been in crisis. After World War I ended, demand for American crops fell dramatically, but farmers had borrowed heavily to expand their land and buy machinery during the war. When prices dropped, they could no longer repay their debts. Farms were foreclosed. Equipment was confiscated. Rural communities that once thrived on agricultural prosperity faced ruin. Yet the worst was still ahead. A massive environmental disaster, known as the Dust Bowl, developed in the early 1930s. Years of poor farming practices combined with severe drought created a catastrophe across the Great Plains. Soil that had once been fertile turned to dust and blew away in giant storms that darkened the sky for miles. Wind carried dust into towns, homes, and lungs. Entire farms were buried. Crops died. Cattle perished. Families who had worked the land for generations abandoned their homes in search of survival. Many migrated westward, especially to California, only to find overcrowded labor camps and fierce competition for low-paying jobs. The Dust Bowl became one of the most painful symbols of the Great Depression, an environmental tragedy layered on top of an economic collapse. At the same time, the psychological state of the nation deteriorated rapidly. Americans who grew up believing in hard work and self-reliance felt helpless. Men who had always provided for their families struggled with the shame of unemployment. Women tried to stretch tiny amounts of food to feed children who often went to bed hungry. School budgets collapsed. Hospitals ran out of funds. Local governments faced bankruptcy. The country, once defined by confidence, found itself overwhelmed by despair. Meanwhile, the federal government under President Hoover struggled to respond effectively. Hoover believed deeply in limited government intervention. He insisted the economy would correct itself naturally. He encouraged businesses to maintain wages and production, but few companies could afford to follow that advice. Hoover resisted direct federal aid to individuals, fearing it would undermine American self-reliance. Instead, he promoted volunteer programs and encouraged private charities to help. But the scale of the crisis overwhelmed every charity, every church, every local organization. Private relief simply could not keep pace with national suffering. In 1931, things grew worse. International trade collapsed as countries raised tariffs to protect their own industries. The U.S. government passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised duties on thousands of imported goods. It was intended to help American businesses, but instead triggered global retaliation. Other nations imposed their own tariffs, reducing American exports dramatically. International markets froze. World economies, already weakened by post-war debts, spiraled downward together. The collapse became global. In 1932, the crisis reached its darkest point. The banking system was in ruins. Unemployment soared past 12 million. Hunger and homelessness were widespread. Hoovervilles expanded around every major city. Dust storms turned daylight into darkness across the plains. Suicide rates increased. Birth rates declined. People lost faith in institutions, leaders, and the future. Many Americans believed the United States might not survive. One of the most tragic events of 1932 was the Bonus Army March. During World War I, veterans had been promised bonus payments to be delivered years in the future. But in the depths of the Depression, these veterans desperately needed the money. Tens of thousands marched to Washington, D.C., building camps near the Capitol and demanding early payment. They stood peacefully, hoping for relief. But Congress refused. Tensions escalated. Eventually, President Hoover ordered the U.S. Army to clear the camps. Soldiers used tear gas and burned the camps to the ground. The images shocked the nation. Many saw it as the government turning its back on the very people who had defended the country. By the end of 1932, it was clear that Hoover's approach had failed. The economy was shattered. Confidence was gone. Millions demanded new leadership and new ideas. The stage was set for a dramatic political shift that would redefine the country. When Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president, he promised hope, change, and a new beginning. His message resonated deeply with desperate Americans. Roosevelt won the election in a landslide, receiving overwhelming support across almost every part of the nation. People believed he represented a lifeline in a sea of despair. They waited anxiously for the inauguration, praying that his leadership would bring relief, stability, and a path forward. But before Roosevelt could take office, the crisis plunged to an even more catastrophic low. In February and early March of 1933, the banking system completely collapsed. People raced to withdraw their money from any remaining banks. State governments began declaring bank holidays, shutting down financial institutions to prevent total failure. By the time Roosevelt stepped into office, almost every bank in the United States had either closed or was on the brink of collapse. The country was not simply suffering. It was teetering on the edge of total financial destruction. The nation waited for Roosevelt's first move. The Great Depression had pushed America to its limits. The years ahead would test the strength of its people, the power of its government, and the resilience of its democracy. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in March 1933, the United States was a country on the edge of total collapse. Banks across the nation had failed or were days from failing. Millions of Americans had lost their life savings. Businesses were shutting down in every city. Farmers were abandoning their land. Entire families wandered the country looking for work, food, or shelter. Hunger and homelessness had become national realities. Confidence had evaporated completely. The American people watched their country unravel and wondered whether anything or anyone could save it. Roosevelt entered the White House facing a crisis unmatched in American history, with a nation desperate for reassurance and leadership. Roosevelt's first major action was bold and unprecedented. On March 6, 1933, just one day after taking office, he declared a nationwide bank holiday, temporarily closing every bank in the United States to stop the panic. It was a risky move, but it halted the massive wave of withdrawals that had been draining the financial system. During the closure, Roosevelt's administration worked quickly to examine the financial health of each bank. Only the banks considered stable were allowed to reopen. Then came the moment that changed everything. Roosevelt addressed the nation over radio in his first fireside chat. Speaking calmly and clearly, he explained how the banking system worked, why it had failed, and why Americans needed to trust it again. His words restored hope. When banks reopened, people did not continue withdrawing their money. Instead, they brought money back, depositing cash that had been hidden at home. The banking system stabilized for the first time in years. Roosevelt moved quickly to implement a sweeping series of programs designed to fight unemployment, restore confidence, and rebuild the economy. These initiatives became known as the New Deal. One of the first goals was to relieve suffering by creating jobs immediately. Programs such as the Civilian Conservation Corps (CCC) hired young men to plant trees, build parks, improve public lands, and construct trails and roads. The Works Progress Administration (WPA) employed millions more in construction, art, writing, teaching, and public service. The Public Works Administration (PWA) launched large-scale infrastructure projects, bridges, dams, highways, and public buildings that still stand today. These programs did not end the Depression, but they helped millions of families survive, restored dignity to unemployed workers, and breathed life back into local economies. Alongside job creation, Roosevelt targeted the collapse of the farm economy. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, aimed to raise crop prices by reducing overproduction, paying farmers to limit planting and stabilize the market. The government purchased surplus crops and livestock to relieve pressure on prices. For many farmers, these measures offered the first hint of relief after years of devastating losses. However, not all farmers benefited equally, and some struggled with the restrictions, especially small producers and tenant farmers. Even so, the AAA marked the beginning of federal efforts to protect agriculture from collapse. Banking reform was another pillar of the recovery. The Glass-Steagall Act created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, guaranteeing that Americans' deposits were protected even if their bank failed. This single reform restored public trust in the banking system more effectively than anything else. The act also separated commercial banks from investment banks, preventing risky stock market speculation from threatening ordinary savings. These reforms reshaped the financial system and helped prevent future crises. Despite these efforts, the Depression remained severe. Unemployment remained painfully high. Businesses were still fragile. Farmers struggled with debt. The Dust Bowl continued to ravage the Great Plains, creating storms of dust that destroyed crops, suffocated livestock, and made large areas of land unusable. Thousands of families, especially from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, fled westward in search of work. Many ended up in overcrowded camps in California, living in tents or shacks while competing for seasonal labor jobs. The journey was long, harsh, and often humiliating, but it symbolized a deeper truth of the Depression. The American people endured extraordinary suffering yet refused to give up hope. In 1935, Roosevelt launched a second wave of New Deal programs to address ongoing problems. Among them was the Social Security Act, a landmark law that established old-age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid for vulnerable groups such as widows, children, and the disabled. For the first time, the federal government created a permanent safety net for citizens. Social Security became one of the most enduring legacies of the New Deal, reshaping the relationship between Americans and their government. Another significant measure was the Wagner Act, which protected workers' rights to unionize and bargain collectively. Labor unions grew stronger, giving workers a voice and improving wages and conditions across many industries. These reforms sought to rebalance power between corporations and citizens, addressing the inequality and exploitation that had contributed to the economic collapse. Still, the Depression persisted. By the late 1930s, the economy had improved compared to the darkest years, but it was far from recovered. Unemployment remained high. Business confidence was fragile. Rural areas struggled. Many Americans feared the Depression would never end. Roosevelt's opponents criticized his policies, claiming the New Deal expanded government too far or interfered with free markets. Supporters argued it was the only thing preventing total national destruction. The country remained divided, uncertain, and cautious. Then, unexpectedly, global events began reshaping the future of the American economy. In 1939, World War II erupted in Europe. While the United States remained neutral at first, the conflict created enormous demand for goods: food, steel, machinery, weapons, vehicles, uniforms, oil, and supplies of every kind. American factories began producing materials for Allied nations under programs like Lend-Lease, which allowed the U.S. to supply equipment without joining the war directly. This surge in production created jobs, revived businesses, and accelerated industrial growth. Many industries that had been stagnant for a decade now operated at full speed. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, the economy transformed completely. The country mobilized on a scale never seen before. Factories converted to produce tanks, planes, ships, and weapons. Millions enlisted in the military. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, taking on roles traditionally reserved for men. The war effort created full employment, eliminated the last traces of the Depression, and ignited an industrial boom that would carry into the post-war era. By the time the war ended in 1945, the United States had emerged as the world's strongest economic power. The Great Depression was over, not because of one single policy or event, but because a combination of government action, social resilience, and global conflict forced the economy into rapid expansion. The harsh lessons learned during the Depression shaped policies for decades to come. Banking regulations, social programs, labor protections, and economic safeguards became permanent features of American life. The country understood that boom and bust cycles could not be left entirely to chance, and that the government had a responsibility to prevent the kinds of failures that had destroyed millions of lives. But beyond policies and laws, the Great Depression left a deeper cultural impact. It changed the way Americans viewed savings, spending, debt, risk, and security. It reshaped the national character, making future generations more cautious and more aware of how fragile prosperity can be. Families who lived through the Depression passed down stories of hardship, sacrifice, thrift, and survival. The memory of empty bank accounts, lost homes, dust storms, breadlines, and unemployment remained a warning embedded within American history. The Great Depression stands today as a reminder of what happens when economic optimism blinds a nation to the dangers beneath the surface. It shows how quickly confidence can collapse, how deeply financial systems impact everyday lives, and how essential stability, regulation, and responsible policy are to national survival. Most of all, it demonstrates the resilience of the American people who endured a decade of suffering yet rebuilt a stronger country afterward. If you found this deep dive valuable, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.